ask you something, and I want you to sit with it for just a second before you answer. When was the last time that someone in one of your meetings said something that made you genuinely uncomfortable? Not rude, not disrespectful, not unprofessional, just honest. The kind of honest that pushes back a little. The kind of honest that makes you stop and really think. If you're having trouble remembering, that's not a good sign. Because here's what I've learned working with organizations. The ones that feel the most peaceful on the surface, well, they're sometimes the most fragile underneath the surface. And that silence that leaders mistake for harmony, that can be one of the most expensive things in the building to fix. I'm Dr. Ashley Newcomb, founder of Inspired Coaching and Leadership, and this is the Resilient Organization. Today we're going to talk about the myth of the drama-free workplace, and I do mean the myth. This is the story of a team that stopped speaking up not because they stopped caring, but because they learned that it simply didn't matter. In our first 2 episodes, we've been tracing what happens when organizations go quiet. We've heard 2 stories, one about Dan and one about Jane. With Dan, he was our senior leader who'd watched his organization disengage after a sequence of very unfortunate events that quietly eroded the trust between organizational leaders and followers. And then we heard about Jane. Jane was our high performer who did everything right and was passed over repeatedly for promotions that she'd more than earned, and eventually left without giving a 2 weeks notice just because she felt defeated. What Dan and Jane's stories had in common is that the silence that settled into both of these organizations didn't start with a dramatic moment. There was no grand gesture or nothing that really grabbed your attention. It started instead with these small shifts, subtle signs that something was off. Nobody really could consistently identify it, and nobody had the language for it yet. Today, I want to give you that language, and I want to do it through a story that has higher organizational stakes than anything that we've talked about so far. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about when an entire team went silent. I want to tell you a story about Shannon and Bryson. I got to know Shannon and Bryson particularly well through working on a project that brought me into their world after the fact. Unfortunately, I was brought in after damage had already been done. And when they sat down and talked to me and started walking me through what happened inside their organization, I have to be honest with you, there were moments in that conversation where I just had to sit back and breathe, because what they described, that was one of the clearest illustrations I've ever seen of what happens when an organization's integrity breaks down from the inside. Shannon and Bryson were part of an IT systems programming team. Their job was specific and genuinely critical to the mission of the organization. Their job was to catch and correct bugs that emerged from system upgrades and changes that touched their one particular area of a much larger interconnected system. Think of it like this. There's these multiple smaller systems that are all feeding into one major central system. Their team was responsible for their own little piece of that pipeline, and they were good at it. In fact, they were so good at it, they were able to catch and isolate programs that actually originated in other of the smaller systems. And here's where it gets sticky. There was a recurring problem with a programmer in another area. This programmer was consistently making significant mistakes, not minor oversights, but real earth-changing errors. The kind that created downstream consequences for Shannon and Bryson's team because the systems were so connected. These were the kind of errors that really had long-term implications if they weren't corrected and fixed. Really the kind of errors that if you were to see them come through consistently, you would wonder if a resume had been falsified. So they did exactly what you would want a team to do. They flagged it, they reported it through the appropriate channels, and they raised the concern professionally and clearly multiple times. And guess what happened? Absolutely nothing. Now here's the part that matters in a really bad way. This programmer, the one that was making all these mistakes, he was the son of a high-ranking official within the organization. And that fact, that single relational dynamic changed everything about how the situation was handled, or more accurately, how it wasn't handled. Because not only did nothing change, but the team was collectively reprimanded about their complaints. Their manager accused them of intentionally targeting this programmer. He accused them of being jealous, of picking on him, of trying to sabotage his work because they didn't like him personally. In short, they were shut down and labeled a squeaky wheel because of who the programmer was related to. Let that sink in for a moment. Here's this rock star team that was doing their job, catching real errors, reporting legitimate problems that potentially saved the company millions of dollars, but they were told that they were the problem. Now, I want to pause right here and ask you to notice something, because this is the moment right here, right now, where this story stops being about one programmer's mistakes and starts being about something much bigger, much more detrimental to the organization's culture. When that team was accused of sabotage for doing their job correctly, they received a message and they received it loud and clear. Only it wasn't the message their manager thought they were sending. What that team heard was this: the rules don't apply equally here. Integrity has a ceiling, and that ceiling is determined by who your father is. So that's an espoused value versus enacted value gap. And I talked about this in our last episode with Jane. Your espoused values are what you say your organization stands for, but your enacted values are what your people actually see you do day after day. And when those two things don't line up, people notice every single time. They feel that tension, they feel that friction, and they feel that discomfort faster than you would ever expect, or as an organizational leader, faster than you'd want your followers to feel. Now, going back to Shannon and Bryson's story, their team made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not a loud one. They didn't storm into anyone's office. There were no picket lines. They didn't file a formal complaint. They didn't start looking for new jobs, at least not at that point. They just stopped. They stopped really caring. They kept doing their jobs within their own system. They kept correcting whatever bugs created problems in their specific area, but they stopped reporting issues with the larger overarching system. They stopped flagging errors that weren't technically their direct responsibility to catch. They pulled back their contribution to the whole and redirected it only to the part that they were absolutely required to maintain. From the outside, the team still looked functional. They still looked like rock stars. They were productive. No drama, no complaints, no conflict. Exactly the kind of low-maintenance team that managers love to point at and say, "See, those are my people. No problems over there. Nothing to see here." But that's the myth right there, and that's something that I need you to hear today. Quiet is not the same as healthy, and the absence of conflict is not the same as the presence of trust. What looked from the outside like a drama-free team was actually a team in crisis. It was a team that had made a very rational, very deliberate decision to withdraw. They weren't disengaged because they didn't care. In fact, they still cared a great deal. They were disengaged because the organization had taught them through direct experience that caring came with consequences, and they simply chose to reserve their emotional energy for things that they thought mattered. So fast forward a couple of months, and then the uh-oh happened. That same programmer, the one whose errors had been flagged and dismissed and never corrected, well, he made a major mistake. And this time it didn't just affect the internal system, it affected the organization's clients. There was a data and usage issue that became public facing, and when it did, it damaged the organization's reputation in a way that took significant amount of time and resources to begin to repair. In fact, to this day, I'm still not sure that they fully recovered their reputation. The employer called me in to help figure out where the teamwork had broken down. They believed that it was a communication issue, and they thought that there was animosity between the silos, that teams weren't talking to each other, and that relationships had gotten contentious, and that a round of team-building exercises would smooth over things and get everyone back to the same page, and everybody would be all happy and teamworky again. And I want to say something gently but very clearly right here. Team building exercises, they cannot fix an integrity problem. They just can't. You cannot trust fall your way out of a system that has taught its people that speaking up will be used against them. When I sat down with Shannon and Bryson and started pulling on that particular thread, what I found wasn't animosity. What I found was a team that had been profoundly and systematically let down repeatedly. They had done the right thing and they had been punished for it. And so they made the completely reasonable, completely human decision to protect themselves and stop extending effort toward a system that wasn't going to protect them in return. Think about this sometimes in terms of what I describe as influence on loan. Every follower in your organization, every member of your team has something that they're extending toward your leadership. You can call it trust, you can call it discretionary effort, call it the willingness to go beyond what's required and contribute something bigger than your individual job description. That's not compliance, that's a choice. And that choice can be withdrawn. And that's something that we're going to talk about on a future episode. But for right now, it's important to note that Shannon and Bryson's team didn't stop working, they stopped investing. And there's a world of difference between those two things. This organization had been spending down that investment for a long time. And the day that crisis hit, they reached into the vault expecting to find resources, initiative, voice, collective problem solving, but that vault was empty. Not because people weren't capable, but because people had quietly and reasonably stopped making deposits into that leadership influence vault. So let's make this personal, because you might be sitting there thinking, I would never let something like this happen. I would never protect someone's poor performance because of who their parents are. And I believe you. I genuinely do. But the fact of the matter is, you never really know what you're going to do until you're in that exact situation. And another truth of this situation is that the myth of the drama-free workplace doesn't just show up in nepotism. It shows up in 100 quieter ways, and some of them might already be present in your organization. Think about the last time someone on your team pushed back on a decision. What happened next? Were they heard? Did they feel safe voicing their concerns? Was their concern visibly taken seriously, even if the decision didn't change? Or did they get the message, the subtle, unspoken, but absolutely clear message that your pushback isn't really welcome here? Think about whether your organizational culture is really rewarding the absence of conflict or the presence of contribution. Those are not the same thing. A team can have zero drama and zero impact, and a leader who never hears bad news isn't leading a healthy organization, they're leading a silent one. So here's my personal take. I've been in and around organizational leadership for about a quarter of a century now, and I can tell you from personal experience that zero drama means zero caring. And if you don't care enough about your organization, you're not willing to fight for it. Some of that drama that kind of grates on your nerves as a leader is actually people expressing how much that they care about the success of your organization. Sometimes they view it as family, and as we all know, siblings fight. So think about whether the people who tell you the truth are celebrated or they're actually being quietly marginalized within your organization, because your team is watching. They're always watching, and they're learning the real rules of your organization, not the ones in the handbook, but the ones that are lived out in the decisions you make, especially the hard ones, especially when it costs you something. And I want to stick another truth in here real quick. When people are onboarded into organizations, there's this quiet kind of truth behind the scenes that happens. We say that onboarding is really twofold. One is the formal onboarding that happens with human resources and employee handbooks and things of that nature. And then there's this other subtle onboarding situation that is actually occurring between longstanding employees and new employees. We call it the water cooler onboarding, because this is where we kind of meet quietly in the hallways and discuss what's really happening in the organizational culture. So the acculturation piece of onboarding Often involves a kind of informal gap analysis between the espoused culture and the enacted culture as perceived by your longest standing organizational members. And yes, someone before you has told me that I get way too excited about organizational culture. So now that that's out of the way, let me give you a quick reality check. Ask yourself these questions honestly. When was the last time that a team member told you something that surprised you? This could be a problem that you didn't know about, a risk you hadn't seen. If you're hearing everything, that's usually a sign of a healthy organization. If you almost never get surprised, that could be a sign that your system has stopped surfacing things to you. And as annoying as those little surprises can be, especially when you're trying to go live, that early surfacing system is a sign that there's psychological safety present in your organization, and that can save you an untold amount of resources, time, effort, energy, maybe even your public reputation. Next, ask if your quietest teams are your best teams, or are they the ones that are just the most disengaged? Don't assume that low maintenance means high functioning. Finally, ask yourself if you found out tomorrow that a team in your organization had stopped flagging a systematic problem because they'd been burned for flagging it before, what would you do? And more importantly, would you even find out? Because in Shannon and Bryson's organization, the answer to that question was no, and it really cost them dearly. Now, I want to be upfront with you. What I'm about to share with you is not a comprehensive fix. These three things are not going to undo years of systematic silence overnight, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But if Shannon and Bryson's story hit a little close to home to you, these are three places that you can start today before you even finish your commute home. First, I want you to audit what your silence is teaching. I don't mean schedule a focus group or commission a culture survey. I mean go back mentally right now to the last 2 or 3 times someone on your team raised a concern or flagged a problem with you. What happened next? Was there any visible follow through? Did that person ever hear back from you? Because your team already knows the answer to that question. The audit isn't for them, it's for you. You need to know what your silence has been communicating, even when you don't intend or didn't intend to communicate anything at all. So, something I want to stick in here in this particular place. Have you ever heard that saying that lack of a decision is a decision? So, if somebody gives you a decision to make and you refuse to make one, that actually is making a decision. Communication works the same way. Just because you don't use your words and just because you don't follow through with actions, you are still communicating something to your team. Something that you might not realize or something that you might not want to communicate to them. Second, separate the complaint from the complainer. This one is a lot harder than it sounds, especially when you're working on a project that might be your baby. Because when the same concern keeps coming from the same person, it's very easy, very human to start evaluating the messenger instead of the message. Have you ever gotten a phone call and you look down at your caller ID and you see the name pop up and you automatically just cringe for having to answer it because of who it is and you know that they're about to complain? Well, make sure that you don't slip into that same habit with your team. Using Shannon and Bryson's team as an example, they raised legitimate concerns about system problems repeatedly. And instead of investigating the problems, leadership investigated their motives. That's a costly mistake. So the next time a concern comes up to you more than once, make a point to look into the issue first. Ask yourself, if a different person had brought me the same information, would I be taking it more seriously? If the answer is yes, that's important information about how you're filtering what you hear. And look, let's be honest here. We've all had that follower or colleague or coworker that just for some reason their personality rubs us the wrong way. That friction might actually cause a bias into how receptive we are whenever they bring a problem to us. So sometimes the reflection isn't necessarily about what we hear, and if we're tired of hearing the same thing over and over again, sometimes we really have to be honest with ourselves about if we have a bias against an individual instead of the message. And third, Make one visible accountability move, not a speech, not a company-wide email like Dan did about your commitment to transparency, just one concrete, observable action that demonstrates your system is responsive to integrity. Make a visible effort to demonstrate that your interpretation of integrity transcends relationship, transcends rank, and transcends the name of who's attached to the problem. It doesn't have to be dramatic, but it does need to be real, and it does have to be visible, because your team is not going to start trusting the system based on what you say. They're going to start trusting the system based on what they see you do. Actions speak louder than words. I know it's cliche, but it's the truth. I want to take a minute right here to share a recurring problem that I see among leaders of a certain mindset. There are certain types of leaders that are very motivated, very driven, very detail-oriented, independent thinkers. They just really want proof behind everything that they do and every decision that they make. However, for some reason, they don't believe that those personality traits exist in their followers. So, organizational leader to organizational leader, I want to share with you that leaders often attract followers with the same or similar personality styles that they have. So, if you as a leader want that data, want that information, want that proof, then chances are you are going to attract followers that want that same evidence. So, instead of saying, just do as I say, the best approach with that type of follower, based on what type of leader you are, is to show them in a very healthy and very empowering way, this is the evidence, this is why we're doing this. And that also helps you grow the same type of organizational leaders that you want to pass the torch to when it's time for you to transition out. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these aren't complete fixes, but they are intentional ones. And intention consistently acted on is where trust starts to rebuild. Now, I don't want to leave you hanging about Shannon and Bryson. So Shannon and Bryson and one other member of their team eventually left that organization. They took their exceptional skills, their integrity, and their collective capacity, and they started their own IT firm. And I don't think it's an accident that the people who cared enough to keep doing the right thing, even when the system penalized them for it, they were capable of building something on their own. The most dangerous moment in an organization isn't when people are loud. It's when they stop speaking and no one notices. And the myth of the drama-free workplace is exactly that. It's just a myth. What looks like peace is sometimes just the sound of people who have decided that your organization is no longer worth their voice, that emotional energy that it takes to speak up for what's right. If what I've described today is resonating with you, if you're starting to recognize some of these patterns in your own organization, I want you to know that there's a name for that. There's a name for what Shannon and Bryson's team experienced. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in our next episode. We're going to look at what happens when capable, competent people are systematically undervalued and passed over, not because of what they can do, but because of the system they're operating inside of. It even has a name. And once you hear it, you're going to start seeing it everywhere, unfortunately. In the meantime, if you want to start putting some structure around what you're observing in your own organization, I've created a short training called When Followers Go Quiet, Diagnosing Hidden Disengagement in Your Own Organization. And if you're not quite ready for that yet, you can download 5 Signs Your Organization Has Gone Quiet. Both are available at inspiredcoaching.net. This has been The Resilient Organization. Thank you for joining me today. I'll see you next time when we talk about organizational Cinderella syndrome.